This is R4E, the Reason for Everything podcast with Arjan Peters. I'm your host, Arjan. In this episode, I sat down with Lisa Gable, a personal mentor and one of the most impressive humans that I know. Lisa is a former U.S. ambassador, CEO, UN delegate, and a Wall Street Journal and USA Today best-selling author. In this episode, we talk about Lisa's experience in turnarounds, her current role as chairperson of the Diplomatic Courier's futuristic think tank, World in 2050, and some amazing life experiences along the way. Enjoy this episode of R4E. Let's dive in. Hi, Lisa. How are you today?
I'm fine. How are you?
I'm doing well, thank you. I appreciate you making time on your busy schedule to jump on the podcast today.
Well, it's great to see you again, as always. I love catching up on what you're doing and all the exciting and interesting things that you're looking at the moment in the market.
Likewise. And I'm excited to dive in today. As you know, we always have our guests select a walk-up song. We picked AC/DC Thunderstruck. I'd love to know what AC/DC means to you, why that song was your selection, and maybe any stories from why that's an important group to you.
Well, I've always liked AC/DC, and I am of the age group that does, but was very thrilled when Marvel comic books brought it back as part of the music behind some of their big hits. In particular, Iron Man was always a favorite. So not only the music, but also the personality.
Absolutely. I mean, there's so many iconic moments from those movies that they put that soundtrack behind it, and so very fitting. I would not have pinned you as an AC/DC fan, so that was quite surprising to hear.
Yeah, no, it does normally surprise other people. I've actually not put forward Twisted Sisters and other things, ZZ Top or other things I might like.
And that's why I love these conversations. It's a good icebreaker, and it's a good way to kind of peel back the layers instantly. So that's a little bit about your music taste, but maybe, Lisa, for the audience members that haven't had the opportunity and pleasure to meet you, maybe just a quick intro from you would be great. We've had the opportunity to know each other for almost 4 years now, but would love to maybe allow you to give a quick intro on yourself to the crowd.
Well, very quickly, I've held positions in philanthropy, business, and academia, as well as the not-for-profit arena. Started my career at 19 in the Reagan administration, worked at the Defense Department in the White House, moved to Intel Corporation when it was a $1 billion company in the late 80s, and saw during the time period that I was there that the company took over 80% of the global microchip market. So I've had a wonderful experience working for 4 different presidents, 2 governors, lots of Fortune 500 CEOs, and a number of billionaire philanthropists trying to solve complex problems. My background is doing turnarounds, so I'm the person people bring in to turn around a situation when it's going south.
You're and that was in less than 30 seconds, and that doesn't even do anywhere close to justice to your unbelievable resume. So I'm excited to jump in and learn more about your experiences and your stories. And maybe we start all the way back with the Reagan administration, how you got started there, and then maybe we can go from that.
Sure. So when I was 19, I had taken a number of summer courses, and so I was already ahead in my credits at UVA as an undergraduate, and found out that there was a appointment called the Student Liaison Officer within the administration. It reported out of the Department of Education under the Secretary of Education, and the administration was in the process of privatizing student loans, and they needed somebody who had put themselves through school. I had, both on scholarships as well as through work, and they wanted a peer to explain to other peers why it was a good idea to privatize the loans, how it would downsize some of the government expenditures, but most importantly, that it would not affect the ability of an individual to get the loan that they needed. It just meant that the loan was coming from a different location, in this case from the banks, as opposed to from the federal government. So I spent 6 months going around the United States, speaking on the topic to other college students, and also had the wonderful opportunity of being named to a bipartisan commission of rising leaders, 3 Republicans and 3 Democrats that were sent to Israel. So had an opportunity to go to Israel for about a week and meet with members of the Knesset, the deputy prime minister, who as well as the man who founded Masada, so an amazing architect and archaeologist that I had an opportunity to meet, named Yigal Yadin. Look him up in your history books, really fascinating Wikipedia read. And that's really what started my interest and experience in the foreign policy field, as well as federal government.
Terrific. And that seems like an excellent jump pad for the rest of your career and foreign policy and forward. But would love to understand before we do guys dive into any of that, why you chose UVA. I'm a Virginia Tech grad, so I'd love to maybe take a step back and understand why you ended up picking University of Virginia.
Well, for a couple of reasons. I was putting myself through school. And so the price of the school I attended was really very important to me, both financially as well as for my ability to do what I wanted to do. UVA and William and Mary were two state schools that I knew had excellent reputations in the area of international relations and government affairs. And I chose UVA, which at that time, I don't know where it ranks today, but it was ranked as one of the top 10 schools in the country. So loved my time at Mr. Jefferson School. Also loved the proximity to Washington, which enabled me to come and do the various internships and work that I did, in addition to being close to my parents, who were about an hour away.
Terrific. And in your undergraduate career, you were able to come up to the DC area for internships and such, but did you go directly to DC after graduating Charlottesville, or?
I did. So basically, I joined the Reagan administration when I was 19, spent my time there, came back and finished up my credits while going back and forth to Washington because I only had just a few remaining credits that I needed to do, and then moved immediately back to Washington. I began the process for my security clearance so that I could work at the Pentagon. Ended up joining the Pentagon about 9 months after I graduated. I had worked on a wide variety of different things in order to pay my rent while I was waiting for that clearance. Ended up being one of the only women who was a political appointee at the Pentagon during the Cold War, but also the youngest person there. So as we tell people in the various stories, I was 5 feet tall, I weighed 96 pounds, I was 21 years old, and my nickname soon became Tinkerbell. So I was an anomaly, gave me an opportunity to learn how to speak with facts and make sure that when I walked into a room, I'd done my homework, that I was ready to participate in the conversation, and that I took the opportunity to make comments that were relevant and keep my mouth shut at other times.
Unbelievable. And it's just crazy to hear that, and how that, like I said earlier, jump-started the rest of your career and propelled you to where you are today. And so with that, you had that nickname of Tinkerbell given to you. How did that end up kind of staying with you, or how did you end up working around that during your time? I know you mentioned coming to meetings with facts, knowing when to listen and when to make your voice heard, but what was that process like being in the minority at the Pentagon at the time, and how were you able to combat that?
You know what? I leaned into it because I knew that data and research were my secret weapon, and the fact that I did my homework and that people understood that I had done the homework before I walked into the room, that gave me a lot of credibility that was missing. I looked like I was 12. There was really nothing I could do to look older. And I was such an anomaly. But at the same time, I was doing my master's at Georgetown, and the program that I was in was 85% men. Most of them were in their 30s. They were men who were working on perhaps getting their first star. They were members of the intelligence agencies who were working on going up to senior executive staff, and they needed to have a master's in order to do that. We had some guys in my class that were Navy pilots and Air Force pilots, and they would bring in films of themselves flying over Libya as we were doing the flyovers there. So my whole time period, I was unusual. And there were only a few women. There was another woman who was also 21. She was brilliant. She moved on quickly to get her PhD and became very well known in the intelligence field for her experience in nuclear strategy. But I was surrounded by unusual people. And when you develop your reputation at that moment, people remember who you are, right? They're 85% men. They weren't going to remember all the other guys who looked just like them and had the same experience they did. Right. They remembered us because we were so unusual. And so throughout my career, when I would be needing letters of recommendation or references, I had this whole network of individuals who were already at senior levels that were willing to support me in my endeavors, and that I have always appreciated.
It's unbelievable. I know your network has always been something that's been a tremendous asset for you and to you throughout your career. And I'm excited to dive into some conversations around Chief and how that's evolved for you as well. But how were you and how are you able to keep in touch with the vast network of folks that you've worked with, interacted with over the years from the time you were 19 till today? I know obviously LinkedIn helps a lot with that today, but back before LinkedIn was around, before cell phones were able to keep you constantly connected, what were you doing to stay in front of people, stay relevant for folks? For whether it was just keeping close personally or for letters of recommendation down the road?
Well, I also ended up working at the White House in presidential personnel. And so I ended up interviewing 1,000 people that were seeking political appointments during the last 2 years of the Reagan administration, as well as helping the transition between Reagan and Bush. And when you meet that many people and you have an opportunity to study that many resumes of successful people, it does give you an inside scoop. And so I really studied people's resumes, and not only met with them, but I actually looked and saw what it was that they did. And so many of those individuals I would contact at later points in times in my career, because I would be attempting to do something I knew that they had done. And so I would seek their advice. And there's no greater flattery than someone calling you and seeking your advice. A number of those individuals that I met at that time, especially the women, would put me onto boards as they were leaving boards. And so that's one way that I got credentialed through boards and commissions at the presidential and gubernatorial level, as well as at the philanthropic level. What I learned is you do need to stay in touch, and you need for relationships not to be transactional. I was a big letter writer. And so there were a list of people that I would send letters to, and I would keep them updated on what I was doing. I would pull them into things that were interesting, because I always worked for CEOs, governors, presidents, some case billionaire philanthropists. What I was able to is give back immediately to very, very senior level people that I may have helped through their nomination process to be an undersecretary of, a department or agency. And so I really kept in touch with where I could help. They were helpful to me. What could I do because of the relationships I had, because of the big programs that I was setting up? And what started happening is I built my personal team, and I brought my personal team into these turnaround situations, and people loved it. Again, people love to give their opinion, but they also like to be part of a successful turnaround. Right. And so through multiple jobs, I've had the same people involved many, many times. If I call people and go, hey, I'm going to do another turnaround and we're going to do this type of partnership, and I thought the organization you're running now would be a great partner, people are like, sign me up. They knew that I delivered on what I promised. I always kept them informed. And secondarily is we had a whole lot of fun.
I know the old saying of your network is your net worth. And I know that you hold that near and dear, and as do I. It's just, time and time again, proven to hold true. And that's interesting to hear that you maintain kind of the same group as you're going from turnaround to turnaround. And so I'm really excited to dive into the book writing process as well. But rewinding back a second, so after you wrapped up at the Pentagon, was your next jump to Intel, or what was that next?
My next jump was to the White House. So when Caspar Weinberger, who was Secretary of Defense, the day he announced his retirement, I received a call from a friend of mine at the White House who said, I'm leaving my job. Would you like it? And, I may have been young, but I was not stupid. And so I immediately said yes. And so 2.5 days later, I was at the White House. And so I was at the White House through the end of the Reagan administration. And one of the first people that I was responsible for identifying and recruiting was the new deputy administrator at the FAA, Federal Aviation Administration. And that person was a woman by the name of Barbara Barrett. Barbara would later in life become, a corporate director at Raytheon. She was ambassador to Finland. She was secretary of the Air Force. She launched Space Force. But Barbara was just coming into her own. And I had found her resume, and I'd gone to my bosses and I'd sold her. So they were very interested. She was down to the final 2 picks. We didn't have, computers and Zoom back then. So all of the interviews had been via telephone as well as one time in person. And she was going to be meeting with the head of presidential personnel, who is a special assistant to the president.
Got it.
And he was 2 hours late for the meeting. So Barbara and I sat in the basement of the White House and talked for 2 hours. And I was going to graduate school at night. I was working on my master's thesis. And so at some point in the conversation, she goes, well, what's your master's thesis on? And I told her it was about the ability of the Chinese to integrate dual use technologies, specifically supercomputers and semiconductors, which is very ironic. Well ahead of my time, didn't know I was. And was looking at their use both in the military sector of the Chinese government as well as in the banking sector. She said, oh, you have to meet my husband someday. He is senior vice president of manufacturing for this company called Intel Corporation. And would you like to meet him? And Barbara and I became good friends. She became my mentor. She fed me occasionally because she knew I was going to grad school and working full time, making $17,000 a year. And she was afraid I wasn't going to eat. But I called her up. I saw a magazine cover in Newsweek, and Newsweek had the front cover was 4 pictures, and it said, which one of these men will be the CEO of Intel? And Craig was one of those. So I asked if I could meet when he came into town. He asked me if I would come to Intel after my time at the White House. And so I literally left working on protocol for the Bush inauguration. I was working for Shirley Temple Black, who was a US ambassador at the time, and literally packed up my ball gowns. And the next day I flew out to Chandler, Arizona, and started my high-tech career.
Wow, that's incredible. I didn't realize the nuance of that story. That I've heard the high-level version a few times, but that's very interesting. So why Chandler, Arizona? I was thinking somewhere else for Intel, but is that where their headquarters were at the time, or why?
No, Intel was headquartered in Santa Clara, California. It's still headquartered there. Mm-hmm. But Craig was senior vice president of manufacturing. Intel manufactured in New Mexico, Arizona, Malaysia, and Israel at that time. And then they later opened up the plants in Portland, Oregon, Hillsborough area of Oregon. But Craig was the manufacturing guru. He was really the person who brought the concept of 24/7 manufacturing, just-in-time manufacturing, what he called copy exactly. And if you Google Craig, and it's really interesting to Google this, copy exactly, and Intel, what he determined is that every Intel manufacturing plant had to be manufactured down to the bolts in exactly the same way, that they would buy exactly the same materials, build it exactly the same way. And that gave a level of predictability. From Craig, I learned statistical process control. And what you're looking at is the number of variables that enter into the manufacturing process. And so for Intel to leap forward and grab what they would during that time period, basically 6 years, 5 years, 80% of the semiconductor market worldwide, they had to meet the manufacturing outputs that were required in order to serve that market. And so Craig was the brilliance behind that, which is one reason that he was named soon thereafter as COO and heir apparent, later as CEO and chairman of the board.
Very interesting. And then I guess, so you were still in your 20s or early 20s at this point. You picked up and left after growing up in the DC, Virginia area, flew out to Chandler, Arizona. What was that transition like for you? You were, again,
it was funny.
Yeah, I'd like to learn more about that.
So I got in at nighttime, and remember, I just worked on protocol for the inauguration for a famous movie actress, right? And so and it was Ronald Reagan, and George Bush, and so you had a lot of old major movie figures there. So very elegant. And I get in at midnight, Chandler, 1989, and the next morning I put it in one day so I could get to know the area before I went to work. And get my little car, and I'm driving around in my rental car, and there's nothing there. There are just, in Arizona in 1989 had a major real estate crash. They had a lot of half-built strip malls. And when you watch The Walking Dead and you see just strip mall after strip mall with like open doors and tumbleweeds rolling in, that's all I saw. And I was like, oh my God, what have I done? And then there are all these sheep crossing the highway. So I was trying to go down Chandler Boulevard to see where Intel was, because I just wanted to eyeball it. So I was on time and ready. So the next morning I get up, I go to work, and I'm all dressed up like I would be for the White House. And someone took me aside and they said very politely, you're allowed to dress down here. That's because they were all in blue jeans and wallabies and tennis shoes and whatever they had on. And I was in my little, suit and pearls. So I really had to learn a lot. I didn't know a soul. So I started calling it Camp Arizona, and I would just sign up for things. And I signed up for scuba diving in Arizona. It was in a swimming pool. I signed up for a weekend of horseback riding to camp out in the desert. I just signed up for stuff in great hopes that I would actually meet people. And I did meet people. But there was nothing there. It was not like today. When you fly over Arizona today, there's a lot in Chandler. I just want to tell you, it was an hour away from real people. Real people, those people were in Scotland. I thought I was going to be, hanging out at resorts all the time. I was in a dust bowl where there was one manufacturing site.
And how long was your stint in Chandler for?
So I was in Chandler for 6 months. A little side note on this is I had a scholarship to study Chinese in Taiwan.
Okay.
And I had not necessarily planned at staying at Intel. I also had an offer to work for AIT, as people know now, because there's a lot of publicity about Taiwan. We don't have an embassy in Taiwan. We haven't had an embassy in Taiwan since the rapprochement between the Chinese and the Americans. And so AIT was the U.S. representation there. But while I was in Taiwan studying Chinese, I saw that Craig was promoted to CEO. And to be quite frank, 1989, 25-year-old woman living in Taiwan. There were no Caucasian women, and Taiwan wasn't nice then. It was the #1 pollution capital in the world. It wasn't a developed country. It was a developing country. And my security clearances were taking a long time between the State Department and the White House. And so I finally called Craig and I said, can I come back to California? So I moved from Taipei to California.
Well, that's that experience in Taiwan must have been, again, just another jump into a different, almost different dimension in a lot of ways. Just kind of, you have your pockets of the DC area not really truly being what the rest of the world is like. And then Chandler, Arizona, Taiwan, and then you moved to Santa Clara. What was that experience like for you? Kind of back to probably some sense of normalcy after.
It was. I ended up deciding I wanted to live in San Francisco. Traffic wasn't as bad then, and I wanted more of a social life. Back then, there wasn't a great deal of social life in Santa Clara, and not a lot of young people. So I basically commuted from San Francisco down to Santa Clara for 5 years. Working at Intel during that time period was amazing. I was Craig's troubleshooter, so I was brought in to take over programs that he was personally interested in. So this was before CSR and foundations and people doing any type of philanthropy. And so I actually set up the first philanthropic programs for Intel, which we set up as models of joint ventures and partnerships that you could build around K through 12 education and science, math, technology training. And so we actually set up a prototype program in 2 prototypes in New Mexico and 1 in Arizona. All were covered in a lot of books and magazines because, again, it was new. Nobody had done it before. We built a charter school on Intel property that had the computer-based training systems that based there so the kids could use it during the day. And at nighttime, our foreign nationals who were working in the manufacturing plants would actually go over and do English training. It was what we did is we piggybacked. We went through Intel training expenditures and we said, where is Intel going to be spending money to train its employees? We had a lot of Vietnamese on the line. They didn't speak English. And so in New Mexico, we were doing long distance training. And so we did a deal with Hughes where part of the Intel contract could service Albuquerque public schools. We built the facility on Intel property, put in CBT so Intel employees could just walk over there and use the equipment, but that way the public school system could. So we did a lot of very leading edge things. We had a program with MIT that we were doing, and we went down with IBM and tested some concepts about integrated learning in Las Cruces, New Mexico, where you have a much higher Native American population and Latino population that had immigrated. So you had a different socioeconomic environment. So we basically took our manufacturing needs, we intertwined them with the needs of the school system, and we used that to improve math and science training in the 2 states that were most important to Intel manufacturing.
Were there other businesses that were doing this at the time, or how were you coming up with this roadmap? Because it seems very elaborate, very complex. And so how are you kind of building these programs out? Where did that come from?
Well, I dreamed it up with my other employees at the Intel training. Nobody else was doing anything. All I knew is that Craig said, you've got to fix this problem. You need to be able to show ROI, and you have no budget with which to do it. And so that is where I learned that when someone puts you into a box, the only way to build a program is to identify people with money, people with common objectives that you have, and build a reason why it is to their business interest for them to partner with you on some philanthropic effort. So we really were the only ones doing it. We ultimately ended up forming a small committee of IBM, Hewlett-Packard, and Intel. I was on my first board at the age of 26 with the American Electronics Association. I was so proud of that. Well, my first board was like 3 of us in the room were the only people doing this. And then we were flying back to Washington, meeting with the National Academy of Sciences and others giving them an overview of what we were doing. And so I check the charter school, as I say in my book, I check on it once a year. It has been one of the top 10 ranked schools in the state of Arizona in math and science since we started it. So I feel that that's a pretty good run rate if it's gone from 1989 to 2023.
Yeah, that's terrific. Have you checked in on them this year? How does that what does that cadence usually look like for you?
Oh yeah, I checked in on their 22 numbers. They're still there. So happy. And okay. Intel still has some involvement with it. It is on Intel property. So it was, and we also brought in Intel training so that the teachers during the summertime when they weren't working, they would actually be interns at Intel. And we set up new ways of actually school management where Intel site managers were involved with the school to build out, again, this concept of integrated learning. The best way to think about integrated learning is if you know, like Discovery Education today uses video and tech books and other things. We were the first launch of that with IBM.
Interesting. And then you mentioned so that at 26, you're on your first board, the American Education?
It was the American Electronics Association. It was a big player back then.
Okay. So that was your first board at 26. Fast forward us to maybe the next big board seat or next big pivot you had out of Intel.
Yeah, the next big one was I followed Barbara Barrett onto the board of, it was called the Defense Advisory Committee on Women in the Services. I was a Bush midnight appointment in the end of the Bush administration going into the Clinton administration. So I was midnight, the president can sign off on so many boards. He signed me off. I was sworn in under Les Aspin, who was Secretary of Defense. Under Bill Clinton, he was the first Secretary of Defense. And that was during a time period called Tailhook. And Tailhook was a massive sexual harassment scandal in the US Navy. It happened at a big party that was called Tailhook for all the flyers, all the pilots, and it was very controversial. And so there were half the committee were Republicans that were signed in under or were basically nominated by Bush, and half the committee were Democrats. And that was where I really learned how you facilitate a path forward for two groups of people who absolutely agree on nothing. And I used process to do so. Because I was still working at Intel, I brought in the Baldrige Award team members to help serve as moderators between the Republicans and the Democrats and the military to identify ways that we could gather information and make recommendations to the Secretary of Defense about issues involving integration of the women into the military. And that's when women's first started going on board ships. So lots going on, but it was a great training ground. When I was 30, I was named vice chairman of the board. And it was an opportunity. Traveled to 52 military bases around the world, did 1,000 interviews, and really honed my skills on how you manage complex problems.
Very interesting. Is there a particular board that sticks out, or not board, I'm sorry, a particular base that sticks out on either the end of the spectrum that's the one that's maybe the best or the most luxurious, the most interesting to you, and then on the other end of it, the one that was maybe scary or frightening or that you would maybe not want to go back to?
Well, again, it's always interesting when you watch horror movies and you go, oh, yeah, I've been there before. It looks just like what I experienced. They took us to Adak, Alaska. Adak, Alaska is a naval base that is on the Aleutian Islands. It was one of the most forward-based listening stations for the U.S. military during the Cold War to basically listen in on what the Russians were doing and also track whether or not they were going to start invading Alaska at any point in time in the West Coast. It is also a period of time that has very little light, right? So most of the year it's dark. And the people who served there really deserve our gratitude for many, many reasons. They were doing the drawdown, right? The Cold War ended. We were drawing down our Cold War infrastructure. And so the base was only partially staffed. There were townhouses that had been built for the families that were based there. And when we came, they go, well, we'll just give each of you your own townhouse. And so we go into, it's almost like a movie set where we're on the street in the dark and there are all these townhouses to choose from. Which one do you want to sleep in? And so they put each one of the DACWITS members in a different townhouse. And it was really spooky and scary. And soon through the night, you'd hear little knocks on the door and we all decided we'd sleep in the same townhouses. We weren't really going to sleep in different townhouses. Right. But what we learned is, the issues, what I really learned about is when you have U.S. military who are doing this type of service. Again, you're in a place that's incredibly isolated. You're away from your family and your friends. It was dark all the time. The mail, the way that they would have to deliver the mail, there were many times where they would do the mail drops and the mail would go into the ocean. And so people weren't getting their mail. And it was truly a snapshot on what sacrifice really means. Sacrifice is twofold. There's the physical sacrifice of being in the military, but there's also the psychological sacrifice when we put people into situations that are either risky. I ended up going to Turkey to Incirlik, which is where the AWACS are flown, and that's where the Kurdish relief effort was taking place. You had 1 million Kurds and tents all around there. So you got to see very different dynamics of what our military does, and just developed an incredible respect. Went to the DMZ and met the young people who were based basically within a 3 to 6 minute flight from the DMZ. So if the North Koreans ever decided to invade, they would be the first ones that would suffer from that. So we really owe a lot to our military.
Absolutely. So that's on one end of the scale. Maybe on the other side, was there any base or area that you went to in your travels with this board that you couldn't get enough of, or you want to get back to as soon as you can?
Well, Hawaii is not a bad place for people to be based. That's one thing I can say. I can tell you that the Navy, hands down, Spain, Italy, Hawaii, even Japan, Navy, not really in bad locations. Air Force, they don't always put them in the nicest places. And Army. So I would just say that, I learned that the Navy really got nice beachfront property.
Very, very interesting. Very interesting. You mentioned Japan, so maybe we jump forward to your experience in Japan and how that came about, and maybe walking us through from your time at Intel up until your ambassadorship.
Yeah, so I joined President Bush's first campaign before he even announced his nomination. It was called his exploratory committee. So I was part of that committee, ended up working on the Bush campaign as a spokesperson. I was their first e-chair because it was the first time email was used in a campaign, and obviously had wonderful relationships at the White House, and had also raised a great deal of money for the president's initial election and his reelect. I was speaking with people at the White House about a job, and they said, well, we have this job, but it requires somebody who, has either lived or worked in Japan. So I raised my hand because I'd been in Japan, actually Matrix managed a group of people in Japan when I was at Intel, had been there obviously with the US military. And they said, and we need somebody who's a fundraiser. So at this point, I raised my other hand. Yep, can fulfill that. Raised a lot of money, both philanthropically as well as politically, so I can handle fundraising. And they said, well, it would really help if the person had a relationship with our current U.S. ambassador, whose name is Howard Baker, and he was the former senator, majority leader from Tennessee. Well, Howard Baker is my brother-in-law's godfather. At this point, I'm waving my hands and yelling, pick me. And it sounded like such a cool job. How could it not be cool? I was going to be the U.S. ambassador to something called the World Expo, which used to be called the World's Fair. Sounded wonderful. My family and I would move to Japan for 6 months. I would be flying back and forth and living there. I'd get to go to big parties. I would have a beautiful pavilion. It was going to be awesome. I looked up what all the other guys got. I was the only woman in 175 years to be in this job, and the men who'd had the jobs lived in beautiful mansions in Portugal and all these other places. Well, there was one small problem, which is we didn't really have the internet and search like we do today. So it was hard finding the bad stuff. And it turned out that the US had actually withdrawn from the expo in 2000 due to a lack of funds. It also turned out that my predecessor had been indicted for his basically, doing things with government money, putting his family on the payroll, setting up foreign bank accounts while he was in the expo. And so Congress passed a law that no one had mentioned. And that law said 0 US funds can be used to operate U.S. presence at this World Expo. Mm-hmm. So I ended up being a full-time, non-paid U.S. ambassador for 1.5 years to the State Department, raising all of the money and using my private sector relationships to fulfill diplomatic obligations. And that was really interesting. We ended up raising $32 million in 6 months, ended up being the only expo to end up under budget, and also to not have an Inspector General's report, which is always really good, according to my lawyers. But we had a lot of flukes. And one of the stories I tell is I had done this, the initial signing of this bilateral agreement with Colin Powell at the State Department. Next day, I'm running off to the airport and I'm getting out of my husband, is driving us, and we get this phone call. And it was from the State Department attorneys informing me that this official visit I was on to sign the second half of a bilateral agreement with a foreign country, that no one could pay for it. And that no one could pay for the flight I was on. No one could pay for 2 weeks in Japan, Tokyo being one of the most expensive cities in the world. And they asked me what we would do. Essentially, my husband and I made an agreement that we would just pay for the entire trip. We couldn't embarrass the president. I'd literally been on CNN the night before, as well as stations across the world with Colin Powell and the ambassador from Japan. And so we paid for it, but I had to figure out how to redesign that business model to make it successful and ensure I didn't go bankrupt in the process. And we did. And that's how we ended up having the first fully 100% privately paid for activity. But the crazy things I did to fulfill our obligations were interesting.
Yeah, unbelievable. There's so much I want to dive into there, but as a quick branch off that, you mentioned your husband and your family at the time. At what point did you and your husband meet, and what was it in? I don't think it was in Chandler, Arizona or in Alaska, but where did you guys end up meeting, and how did that story come about?
Well, my husband and I met in Lake Tahoe. A friend of mine who was a British family that had lived in Africa. He was a private equity guy in San Francisco, had a party every year called Strawberry Games. And he would send out these very formal invitations. He would rent out an entire lodge in Tahoe, and he would invite 90 people, 45 men, 45 women. He was maniacal about the curation of who attended. So he made sure he had X number of doctors and lawyers and VCs and, engineers and marketing people. And turns out that 10 people a year met and ended up getting married or engaged through this party. But the key about the party was that Friday night you would have drinks, everybody was meeting. The next day you were hiking, biking. It was California. That's what we did, and golf. And at 5 o'clock on Saturday night, you had to be in your pajamas. And you had to be downstairs, and he had a formal dinner, very formal dinner, prime rib, reggae band, jazz band, but everybody was in pajamas. And everyone in San Francisco spent an incredible amount of time choosing their pajamas, whether they chose footy pajamas or lawns pajamas or sexy pajamas, whatever they chose. But my husband was wearing a White House bathrobe. And at that time, you couldn't buy, it's not like today where people have all this stuff on the internet. You had to have worked in the White House to purchase something with the White House logo on it. And it turned out his sister was in the same office that I had been under Reagan. She was there under Bush. And so that's how we started talking, is because of the White House bathroom.
It sounds too good to be true. That's unbelievable. Did you guys know who was going to be at this event beforehand? Was he able to curate this road, make sure he was ready to go, or?
No, in fact, I like to brag that I was frequently invited to these parties, but my husband had never been invited before. But he was an Apple evangelist. He had just, I think, introduced the Power Mac. He'd just done a trip around the world introducing the Power Mac as an Apple evangelist. And he had just come home after 3 months of traveling, and a friend of his called, and she said, "Jim, there's this party in Lake Tahoe and they need men." Well, Jim was 30-something years old, and he said, "You know what? I can make it." And so that's how he ended up being there.
Unbelievable. And so diving back into your story. So then Jim drives you to the airport to go to Japan. You guys figure out the funding side of it. What was next step for you professionally after that?
I rested. I went back into consulting for a period of time and ended up serving on a number of business boards, companies that ended up being sold to Fortune 500 companies, some in the networking space, some in the national security defense contracting space. And I got recruited in 2009 to launch a large self-regulatory effort led by 16 food and beverage CEOs, led by Indra Nooyi, who is then the CEO of PepsiCo. The food and beverage companies had been really getting attacked in the press as basically peddling sugar and fat to an American population that loved to eat. The rise of the obesity numbers were very concerning within the field of public health. And so we had reached this very critical moment where there were decisions being made about regulating the content of food, sugar, fat, sodium. And so the companies wanted to come up with a self-regulatory effort where they could reformulate their products in the way that best made sense for their products. I mean, they made ice cream, frozen foods, pizzas, snacks, beverages. There was no commonality in these products. And so we went through a very extensive process with the public health community, trying to identify what we were going to do, couldn't come up with a path forward. And so the CEO of McCormick, the spice company, said, we've got this thing called our Idea Lab. It's run by a bunch of people from McKinsey. They help come up with innovative ideas for people who are entering new markets. Maybe they can help. And we went to Baltimore. We had a meeting. And we were on day 2. People were exhausted. I had a huge headache. There were white papers hanging all over the walls as we were looking at really 35% of food sold in America, trying to identify where we could set a standard that we could measure and against which everybody could operate without negatively hurting their businesses.
Right.
And essentially, the chief scientist of the Campbell Soup Company was talking to an epidemiologist. They jumped up and they yelled, it's all about calories. And what we realized at that point in time is if we reduced calories, we would reduce sugars and fats, but everyone could do the calorie reduction in the way that made sense for their product. We announced with Michelle Obama that we would reduce 1.5 trillion calories from the marketplace in 5 years. We ended up reducing 6.4 trillion calories 3 years in advance, beating our goal by 400%. And 99% of products sold in America were those lower calorie products. That's what drove the market at that time period. So it demonstrated that when the market comes together, they competed on health and wellness. They saw it as a strategic and a business advantage, but they had the flexibility not to have a regulatory process, but instead to be able to make changes with 2 independent outside auditors auditing the changes they made to ensure that everybody was doing what they were supposed to do. That's how we were successful.
Super fascinating. And the question that naturally comes to mind in terms of self-regulation immediately jumps to the high-tech companies today and all of the news and headlines you hear about everything from Apple to Google to all of the latest with Microsoft and OpenAI. Do you think that that's going to be the path forward for all of these high-tech companies, is the self-regulation there? What do you think the resolution there is going to be? I know that's the question of the hour on Capitol Hill as well as in Silicon Valley, but we'll be curious your perspectives there.
It needs to be self-regulation. And, you may have seen an article that I wrote, which is that under when Reagan came into office, there was something called the Grace Commission. And the Grace Commission looked at things like the cost of government on businesses, right? The cost of regulation. I think we need to reformulate the Grace Commission and bring together the best, the brightest, the smartest people from industry as well as from government to come up with a standard that is fluid. We cannot currently, and this was what my article talked about, we are not keeping up with the pace of innovation, and we are falling dreadfully behind other countries in the biopharma space, in the medical device space, in high tech. AI is just the most visible example of the risk we run if we try to force fit this into some regulatory structure that was built in the 1970s or the 1980s. And what I remind people is that literally the people who designed this stuff were not alive when we set up the regulatory system. We didn't have cell phones. We didn't have laptops. We didn't have Zoom. How in the world would a system that was set up in 1985 or 1979 even have the capacity to regulate the technology? Right. It doesn't. And it's changing at such a dramatic pace. AI, blockchain, a lot of these new technologies, we need small modular nuclear reactors. We have really big problems that we need to solve. We have huge national security threats from China. Absolutely. We've got to, as a bipartisan group, we've got to make a decision that this whole system does not work for where technology is going tomorrow.
It's an amazing point. I feel like most folks on either side of the aisle outside of DC are on the same page about that self-regulation, but for whatever reason, the folks on the Hill, and this is a very blanket statement, but it just seems like it's not clicking, and there just needs to be some path forward here, because we're, to your point, losing momentum against China and other countries as well, especially with technology like AI that's so rapidly evolving.
I think one of the best places where I experienced it myself is my husband and I gave funds to help move people out of the front lines in Ukraine during the first month of the war. So we gave money to former special operations medics and doctors that were part of a foundation that we'd worked with for 30 years. They've been doing this in Afghanistan and other places. They're approved by other governments. And we send them money through a wire, right? People are dying. We literally had the government of Zelensky's government calling and saying, can you get these orphans out of this location? The money did not arrive to them for 45 days. It was wired. And so I was meeting with someone who had been a very major executive at the UN Refugee Council. And he said, and he showed, he'd worked it all out. And he goes, if blockchain works, and if there's some way to have some stable cybercoin process, not necessarily Bitcoin, but something that is backed against the US dollar or whatever, he said, if that worked, let me show you what we could get rid of from a bureaucracy standpoint. He showed slide after slide of org charts with red X's through them. And what he told me is that when money goes into a disaster and it goes through the UN, it can take up to 18 months for that money to get to the person. So if you think about the poor people in Turkey and Syria right now after the earthquake, the funds are still going through this very bureaucratic process. If we can get technology to work, all of that goes away, right? All those validations, the credentialing, all the steps that have to take place in the bureaucratic process, and you would get money to the people who need it faster. It's only one example. We talk about climate change, we talk about energy stability, but a friend of ours who started a company called Last Energy, he just announced $19 billion worth of sales in Europe for small modular nuclear reactors, but he can't build it in the United States.
Why is that?
We can't get through the National Nuclear Regulatory Commission.
Huh.
So we are literally shipping our technological innovation to solve really big problems out to other countries because our regulatory system won't allow us to deploy that innovation here. And that's wrong.
Very interesting. And then what about situations like the CHIPS Act and some of these efforts to try to onshore a lot of things that have been offshored just from a national security perspective, and I guess just broadly speaking, to get it back in the hands of US labor and back in the system? How's that? I mean, from your thesis to now, I mean, that's changed significantly, but what's your take on that?
I would like for the money to go towards building manufacturing plants, but our cost structure is still not competitive with Taiwan. It just isn't.
Right.
And so when we have various regulatory requirements within states, as well as from a government's perspective, that's adding a huge percentage of cost to the building of a plant, then your tax dollars are not working as effectively if they can to build that plant. We desperately need to build that plant. As we learned during COVID, relaxing some government rules during a point of crisis does enable you to move innovation very quickly into the market, fast, effectively, and safely. During times of war, when we had to build all those ships in World War II, I am sure there were a lot of waivers that went into place because we put together an entire fleet in a very short period of time. We need to be thinking about that. We need to say, but as I understand from even more requirements are now being placed on those dollars. Well, you've got to do this with them. You've got to do that with them. Well, you've got to change this. You've got to change that. No, we need to manufacture chips in the United States. What is the most cost-effective, efficient, fastest way of doing that? It is not piling on a bunch of rules. I tell people sometimes it's like you're telling the manufacturer to, hop on one foot, tap their nose, tap their head, turn around in circles. Oh, and then we'll give you the money. No, it shouldn't work that way.
Yeah, to your point earlier, there's so many examples of where that bureaucratic process seems like it's getting in the way of innovation, of growth, what have you.
And also national security. We have a national security issue. It's called energy and it's called microchips. We've got to look at all the additional costs we are placing on our system to keep us from being able to bring forward those solutions. And we as a bipartisan group could do that. We really could. Ro Khanna, I've worked with Ro Khanna. He's a great congressman. We disagree on various political philosophies, but he's been very effective talking about this. There are other people who are effective talking about this. It's an important issue.
Absolutely. And it's going to be unbelievable to see how this all plays out, especially, the thing we can't ignore is all of the deep fakes and the voiceovers of celebrities, politicians, what have you, that are circulating on social media and everywhere else now. And so seeing how all of this plays out from, to your point, a national security perspective, from in my eyes, I think that the artificial intelligence, or the threat of the potential issues around that going into this next election cycle, on top of microchips and the energy transition as well, is something I'm keeping a close eye on. But it's going to be fascinating to see how it plays out, and scary too.
Right. The thing is, I've been following these technologies since the late 80s as they've evolved, but I'm not a technologist. Mm-hmm. I had someone the other day ask me to review patents. I'm like, no. I said, you need to understand, if you explain to me what the technology does and where it can go, yes, I can help you devise a policy, but I'm going to heavily rely on the technologist. We need people who make stuff to make the decisions. And we need people who are the innovators and the creators. And you've got brilliant people at Palantir, you got brilliant people at Google, you've got really smart engineers. I'm married to one, and I can tell you, I don't want me, Lisa Gable, for as knowledgeable as I supposedly am, and it's not that knowledgeable, to be the one making these decisions. It's got to be those really brilliant people who understand how the technology actually works, not just I'm asking ChatGPT questions about how I should revise my post for LinkedIn.
Right. Well, I appreciate you entertaining me, keeping me going down that rabbit hole. And like I said, it is fascinating hearing your thoughts, especially because you were passionate about it in your 20s, as it seems like you are now. And so I guess getting back on track because there's just a lot more I want to dive into, but being mindful of your time, walk me through maybe your experience after leaving, after going through FAIR, going into your experience at Chief, and then maybe rounding us out with writing your book and what you're on to today. And so whatever direction you want to take it from there, but I want to tackle as much as we can.
Yeah, well, since 2009, I've been heavily involved in what I call the food as medicine space, and that is food that meets the needs of diet-related disease, and also products. So whether it's biologics or if it's medically tailored meals, whatever it is. And so I was involved with that with the obesity space, FAIR, obviously with food allergies. And now I'm serving on an advisory board for a company called Roots Food that is making medically tailored meals for people with diet-related diseases that are around obesity, cardiovascular disease, hypertension, et cetera. So that's where I'm focused from a business perspective, the intersection of agriculture, and CPG and technology. But I was thrilled to join Chief, which is this wonderful network of women, and really thrilled when I was at FAIR, I joined Chief, and it allowed me, when we couldn't go out and travel, to start meeting people. It became a platform for me to just network on behalf of the organization,
right.
From a business perspective, as well as from a fundraising perspective and key influencer standpoint. Really helped create a good group and network of people who could help us do our business when we were effectively, operating in isolation. I've stayed involved with Chief because I've now retired as of January. I affiliated as a distinguished fellow in the SMU's Lyle School of Engineering for the Hunt Institute for Engineering and Humanities, again, looking at the intersection of all of these different categories and the impact of regulation as well as innovation cycles. But one thing about when you retire is that you no longer are meeting people who are younger than you are. And what Chief does is it's really their sweet spot are women who are in their 40s and early 50s that are rising executives at companies. And so it's really enabled me to do something which is hard to do, which is build out a network of people that are still within the business category and seeing where I can provide value to what they're doing. As you mentioned, I wrote a book that launched in October of 2021. It ended up being on the Wall Street Journal and USA Today bestseller list. And so that book is about turnarounds that I've done in business, government, and philanthropy. A lot of the stories that I've told today. I do a lot of public speaking, as well as I took over as chairman of the board of the World in 2050, which is the futuristic think tank of a foreign policy magazine, the Diplomatic Courier. I've been on the Diplomatic Courier's board for 16 years. All of those things come together because I truly do see as my mission at this stage in life is to help the next generation of leaders who are solving the complex problems we face. And when I look at my mentoring, I've been mentoring people for going on almost 40 years. And I look what's going to take to get us to 2050. And I think in decades, that means I've got to mentor people in their 20s, their 30s, and their 40s, because by 2050, they are going to be the ones running the world. And we want the world to arrive well. So the obligation is upon me and my peers to ensure that all those points of contact help them both in their jobs, in helping them move the innovations that they're creating to market, in helping them solve the complex problems. It's time for people like me to step back and to make sure that they have the support system that they need in order to move forward so that we can get to where we need to go.
Unbelievable. And I'm excited to learn more about the 2050. Is it the World for 2050? Is that what the project's called?
World in 2050. So we basically track megatrends. We track things like basically the exponential technologies like AI, quantum computing, climate change, the future of the workplace, societal distrust, government institutions, and the weakening of those institutions. We have a partnership with Gallup. So we also track the unhappiness polls that Gallup has been tracking, which has seen levels of happiness and unhappiness since 2012.
Very interesting. And what I know you mentioned how you're helping to mentor and guide folks as they're hopefully making it to 2050 and becoming the leaders of tomorrow. But what does your involvement look like in that organization today? Is it a day-to-day role for you, or is it more something that you're kind of ambiently involved with, or how does that work for you today?
Basically, it's providing a leadership role, helping the founder, a woman by the name of Anna Rold, who I met when she was 26, and she's brought this whole organization forward, ensuring that I'm there to support their contacts with government leaders and key influencers around the world, but also helping them with their business plan. Everybody is figuring out what's the best business model to help move us forward to 2050. Where are the right partnerships? We love our partnership with Gallup. We have partnerships with other organizations that are involved in these various trends. And so when I was in Davos, I was the old one in the room. I'm there with a bunch of digital nomads and guys involved with Bitcoin and cybercoin and blockchain. And they're all asking questions about things that I'd done in my career and things that they were figuring out with their businesses. But as I said, it's people like you, it's people like them that if I can help them as they are designing and building out the operational capacity of their business, then they are all well positioned to help solve those big problems. Absolutely. No, it's incredible. And I'm excited to see where that journey takes you and what the next steps are for you and your exciting career. And I'll be sure to plug Turnaround in the show notes because that was one of my favorite books I read last year. It was top of my reading list. And I really enjoyed that. And then one of the questions I had for you now, as I was thinking through your unbelievable resume, and we barely scratched the surface on a lot of the items, but I would be curious, if you were there any situations where you ever thought about if you would have done a different career before you were joining the Reagan administration when you were 19? Did you ever think about going in any other direction from a career perspective or a life perspective? Well, I mean, my mother and father thought I was kind of nuts. I had I wasn't just a petite person. I was this tiny little person who was just bound and determined to do military affairs during the time period where no girls weren't doing that. And so, no, I actually wanted to join the military. I tried to join the Navy in Naval Reserves, and I didn't pass the medical. And to this day, I can only imagine what they all thought when I was walking through there. So I really did think I would actually at least be a reservist in the military. And I probably assumed that I would stay more directly in the military national security side. But I was just so fortunate that when I was at the Pentagon, that I was assigned to work on supercomputers and semiconductors so that I was able to, throughout my career, I've been able to transition back and forth between the two sectors. And it's just been particularly exciting for me that we're back to where we were, right? Quantum computing, AI, all of a sudden, people are starting to understand that these consumer electronics, these consumer technologies, technologies that are out there in our everyday to day lives have military capacity with TikTok, that they have capacity to do things that aren't to the benefit of our country. And so I feel like I've come full circle.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I guess to that end, in the spirit of the Reason for Everything podcast, and as someone who's led some of the biggest businesses in the world, as someone who's traveled around the world and seen some unbelievable things, both scary like in Alaska and some other amazing places that you've been and people that you've met, do you have any kind of closing words of wisdom for the audience and guests as we wrap up here?
Yeah, it's a tough time period right now. We've been through them before. And if people think that it's unique, I suggest you study history. I have spent a great deal of time going back and studying inflection points throughout history. I spent a lot of time rereading classical political philosophy like Locke, Hobbes, Thoreau, Socrates. And the reason why is it helps put things into perspective. And the reality is people cause problems and people fix problems. And we have had technological innovations that have brought us, the Renaissance, it's brought us Greece, it's brought us, the rise of the Roman Empire, the United States as a superpower. But things always happen. And it really comes down to how people manage those inflection points, how they use the gifts that they have been given, the blessings that they've been given at that point in time in the way that is going to best meet the needs of people. And they don't do things for their own benefit. They make decisions based on what's the best for everyone, not just themselves. And hubris throughout history has always been the problem.
Well, Lisa, I couldn't agree more. And I greatly appreciate your time. I feel so fortunate and lucky to have you as a mentor in my life, and look forward to keeping in touch here, and really appreciate your time. And thank you so much for joining today.
Great. So nice to be with you. Thank you.
Thanks, Lisa.